The Lakin's home. Upon first glance, it looked like a traditional two-story home. In fact, it was very inviting on the outside. The house had a wraparound porch, white picket fence, well-established oak trees, cute little flowers dangling in hanging pots. It looked like the normal suburban American dream. That's where the normalcy ended, though. I remember when it first popped up on my radar. It was in the heat of the summer, and that particular day was sweltering. The family that owned it said it belonged to their deceased grandmother. They didn't want anything in the house and said that I could sell it with all the furnishings inside. It was rare that I even had clients willing to do this, so obviously I had questions. "Gretchen, are you sure you don't want anything from the house?" My words were nothing but sympathetic as I shoved the "for sale" sign into the front yard. Cool blue eyes stared up at me before reverting to the ground. "I appreciate the concern, but the rest of the family doesn't want anything to do with this house, and neither do I." Curiosity swirled around in my head as I glanced up at her, swiping the perspiration that began to bead just above my brow. I silently wondered why no one even wanted to step foot inside. Had her grandmother really been that horrible of a person? Has anybody come to grab any of her belongings, though? The furniture's fine to leave behind, but what about some of the more personal things? I questioned. Crossing her arms, Gretchen sort of shuffled in place before saying, "All of that has already been taken care of. We really just want this house off our hands, and we heard that you're pretty good at what you do." A small, understanding smile tugged at my lips. I wouldn't push it any further. I'm sure they had a reason for wanting to get rid of it, and the last thing that I was going to do was pry. I was a realtor after all, not a therapist. "I'll get it sold." Reaching out a hand, I shook hers and offered a few words of reassurance before going about my way. That night when I came home, I kicked my heels off at the front door, tossed my blazer on the couch, and listed the Lakins' home as I sat down at my kitchen table and ate dinner. The only thing that I knew about the woman that owned the house was that she lived alone for about a year after her husband had passed, and that none of her family wanted anything to do with her. For some reason, a part of me felt bad for her. Looking around my own space, I couldn't help but contemplate what would happen with all of my things if I had passed. I lived alone and my parents were out of state. I would visit them a couple of times a year around the holidays, but besides that, I didn't have a husband or children to pass anything on to. There is a freedom that came to living on your own, but everybody failed to mention that there was an overwhelming amount of loneliness that came with it too. I was successful, sure, but I didn't have anybody to share it with. And some nights, that was an unbearably empty feeling. And being in my mid-20s, I should have been easy for me to find somebody to fill that void. But these days, it was much harder than I had even anticipated. I had tried dating sites, but I wasn't half as good at listing myself as I was at listing houses. Cracking open my fridge, I pulled out my favorite cheap wine and poured myself a glass. As I lay in bed, I couldn't help but look over at the empty spot next to me. My hand stretched out and brushed over the spot, the fabric cool and smooth against my touch. Sleep didn't come easy that night, but then again, it didn't most nights. When I awoke the next morning, I shoved my feelings aside and got straight to work. And despite the strange circumstances surrounding the Lakins' house, I was sure that this would be an easy sell. I wouldn't have to deal with coordinating with the homeowner to see when they could leave for 30 minutes to an hour so that I could show the house. And from what it looked like on the outside, I didn't think the house would need any kind of renovations. This sale should have been a piece of cake, but I couldn't have been more wrong. Hindsight is indeed 20/20. The second I received the key to the house, I was more than excited to see what the inside looked like. If it appeared as good as the outside, I was really in business with this property. When the key finally twisted and the door had unlatched, I stepped inside and I was instantly confused. Whipping out my phone, I looked back at these sellers' text messages, just to make sure that I hadn't misunderstood anything. Sure enough, the proof that I had been searching for was staring right back at me on my phone screen. This place was supposed to be fully furnished. Instead, it was completely empty. Shrugging it off for a moment, I decided to give the house a walk around. Everything was surprisingly up to date and looked to be in good working condition. Whether it really was would be up to the home inspector though. The light clicking of my heels on the hardwood reverberated all around the empty rooms as I roamed to and fro between each one. The kitchen was spacious, everything that a young family might be looking for. And gorgeous granite countertops, a sizable pantry, double ovens, a large stainless steel refrigerator, and various other appliances. Before I got a chance to really explore the rest of the rooms though, my phone rang. It wasn't a number that I recognized, but then again, I didn't think much of it. I was a realtor after all. I had new clients reaching out to me every day. "Hey, this is Eleanor." Holding the phone up to my ear, I waited to hear a response. "Hello?" Pulling the phone away from my ear for a second, I glanced at the number and then quickly put it back to my ear when I heard a crackle of static and then humming. Whoever was on the other end of the line was humming some kind of strange little song. I didn't have time for this. I still had 2 other houses that needed to be shown, a box of cookies to drop off, and some paperwork that had to be signed. Hanging up the phone, I shoved it into my pocket before glancing around the space one last time and leaving. When the last paper was signed for the day, I reclined back in my office chair and looked at the clock with a breath of relief. Switching on the lamp in the office, I straightened up my desk a little bit and dumped the papers that I didn't need into the shred box. Glancing out the window, I watched as black fuzzy moths circled the little lanterns just outside of the real estate office, all of them bathing in its warm, hazy glow. Darkness was beginning to envelop the parking lot, and it had been one heck of a busy day. One of the hardest parts of being a realtor was juggling everything. The first thing that I wanted to do when I left that night was to grab some Chinese takeout, take a bubble bath, and binge watch some American Horror Story. And grabbing my blazer off the back of my chair, I snatched my purse and headed out to my car. I was more than pleased that everything ran so smoothly and that I was able to get everything done. My showings went great and I already had an offer on both of the houses. I was sure those deals would be closed in no time. Both couples were already pre-approved for the loan amount, and the ones that wanted the first house I showed settled on paying the closing costs. It had been a productive day. That was until I realized that in my hurry to get everything done, I had taken that call and forgotten to lock up the Lakin's house. The minute my car pulled into the driveway, I threw it in park and raced up to the door with the lockbox in hand. The second that my eyes landed on the door though, I stopped dead in my tracks. The lockbox fell from my grasp and my hand rummaged through my purse for my taser. The door was slightly ajar and the same humming that I had heard from that phone call could be heard from within the confines of the house. I really did not have time for this. And cautiously, I used the pointed toe of my heel to slowly kick the door the rest of the way open. And the humming that I had heard from before grew deathly silent. There was a strange sense of tension that seemed to be filling the air, almost like a feeling of dread. With a quick glance behind me, I surveyed my surroundings for a moment. The sprinkler in the neighbor's yard was still spitting water, the sound of its spray hitting the sidewalk every time it turned toward the right. The leaves on the oak tree swished and swayed as a slight breeze drifted through them, the sound unnervingly eerie. Right next to me, the little white porch swing screeched on its old, rusted hinges, the sound a bit forlorn and sad. The whole atmosphere of this place had shifted since I had seen it in the daytime. Now it was unsettling. When I finally turned and stepped back into the house, I couldn't help but notice just how much it had changed. It didn't look like the house at all. It was as if it had morphed into something else entirely. My hand fumbled for the doorknob, and as I did so, my heart started to race when I realized that it wasn't there. In fact, when I turned around, all evidence of a door was gone, like it had completely vanished. Fear began to build deep within me, taking root and spreading throughout my body until it took all that I had not to panic. Something about the space was oddly familiar to me, almost as if I had seen it before, except it was different in a way that felt dangerous. The room was dark, but I was able to make out some stairs leading down to water, or at least that's what it sounded like. With nowhere else to go but down, I slowly descended the stairs, my ears straining to hear any kind of sound because of how dark it was. There were lights that flickered occasionally, and because of that, it helped me see the edge of each stair. I didn't know how far down I was going, and the last thing that I wanted to do was trip. After a few minutes of walking, I couldn't help but notice the temperature change. Pulling my blazer tighter to my body, I yelped when I noticed that I had stepped into something wet. Glancing down, I noticed that the stairs were now descending into water. A quick turn on my heel only proved to make matters worse. All the stairs that I had previously walked down were now gone. It was nothing but pitch black. Clenching my eyes shut, I tried to bite back my ever-growing anxiety. Every fiber of my being was telling me that what I was experiencing right now did not make sense. But my eyes saw nowhere else to go but down into that water. That worry only seemed to grow as I peered down in it. The water was a sort of inky black, and there was no way of knowing just how deep it was, and I had never learned how to swim. Forcing down the lump in my throat, I tried to push past my fear one step at a time. And kicking off my heels, I stepped down deeper and deeper into the water until it was a little past my hips. A strand of hair fell rebelliously from my ponytail, sticking to the side of my face. As my hand came up to brush it out of the way, I couldn't help the shiver that ran over me as I waded deeper into the water. I tried and failed to steady my breathing, the harsh inhale and exhale of my breaths echoing all around me. My legs trudged through the waters cautiously before I took one more step, and I plummeted below the surface of the frigid waters. A strangled cry left my lips as I thrashed around, fighting to keep myself afloat, but it was almost as if weights had been tied to my ankles. When I finally sank to the bottom, the need to breathe was so critical that I thought that I surely was going to pass out. My eyes burned, but my lungs burned even more. Ice-cold terror filled me as I felt my body succumbing to the loss of oxygen. When I finally gasped for a breath of air, though, I was surprised to find that I was completely fine. Confusion swirled around my thoughts as I peeled open my eyes and I looked around. And that's when I felt it. White-hot pain seared through my ankle as something tore into it with what felt like sharpened teeth. Looking down below me, I noticed nothing but a huge black hole. My body twisted and turned as some unknown force sucked me into it. Kicking violently, I tried to fight it, but it was like the more that I struggled, the harder it worked to tug me down. Down until all I could do was scream. In a matter of seconds, though, a strange sense of exhaustion washed over me before my eyes drooped and my body went limp. When I finally came to, I had awoken slowly. Coughing, I sputtered out large gulps of water. My lungs burned and my ankle ached. Sitting up, I looked around me and noticed that I was in a nursery. Peering down at my ankle, I half expected to see a tattered mass of flesh and bone. I was pleasantly surprised to see that everything was fine. Running my hands over my clothes, I stared down at the fabric in confusion. It didn't even feel like they were wet. Besides my incessant coughing and the water that I had just thrown up, everything else was normal. Standing on shaky legs, I slowly turned and took in my surroundings. A strange sense of nostalgia crept up on me as I walked over to the crib. Little pink peonies danced across the wallpaper surrounding the room. As my hands brushed along the smooth wooden frame of the crib, my fingertips froze, coming to an abrupt halt. There, nestled inside the crib, was a baby. Its big, green eyes stared up at me expectantly, studying my features before it reached up towards me. Almost instinctively, my own hand reached down to meet its much smaller one. An overwhelming feeling of incomprehensible melancholy clung to me as the infant's fingers wrapped around my own. It was almost as if, "Honey?" Yanking back my hand, I turned to see a man whose warm brown eyes stared at me from the doorway, regarding me with so much love and adoration that it was odd. Do I know you?" Slowly, I watched as he crossed the threshold and approached me, his expression morphing into one of confusion. The second that he opened his mouth, though, I was horrified to see that water began pouring out in inhuman amounts. Panic erupted from within me as I scrambled over to the crib to grab the child, the need to protect it pulling at some maternal strings buried deep within me. The second that I peered into the crib, though, there was no evidence that it had ever even been there. Shuffling towards the door, I watched as it melted down off the wall and into the water like a thick brown sludge. With clenched fists, I pounded on the wall desperately, tears streaming down my face. This was like a nightmare that I couldn't get out of. But that's when I heard it, the faintest whisper of hope. "Wake up." "What do you mean?" I wanted to scream. "I am awake." And then it was there again, the tone of voice smooth and even. "Eleanor, you've got to wake up." And closing my eyes, I held my breath and waited for the water to once again overtake me. I could hear it sloshing against the walls around me as it climbed up higher and higher until it covered my head, and then it was quiet. Tumbling backwards, my knees buckled as I fell into the water. When I opened my eyes again, though, everything appeared to be normal. I was back in the house as if none of that had ever happened. Sunlight streamed through the windows and cast shadows on the walls opposite of them. A couple of leaves scuttled across the hardwood caught my attention as I noticed that the front door was cracked. Hurriedly, I wrenched myself off the floor and ran out the front door without sparing it another glance. The second that I got into my car, I peeled out of the driveway. I couldn't help but sob. Something was very wrong with that house, and Gretchen knew about it. All of her hesitance to even step foot on the property made sense now. I knew that no one would believe a single inkling of any of this, though, so I did the only thing that I could think of. I ran home, changed my clothes, and composed myself. I had to sell this thing. Within a week, I had pawned it off to a couple in their 20s. Some part of me felt bad, but another more terrified part of me was just glad to be rid of it. I knew this didn't make me any better than Gretchen, but I didn't know what else to do. I was so shaken up that just washing my hands of that house was the only thing that I could think of. About a month later, the couple had been reported missing. Guilt clawed at my insides the moment that I saw their faces flash across the TV screen. The house had claimed someone else. Heck, it almost claimed me. A part of me wondered what it presented to them. Did they get stuck in one of those strange in-between places? Soon after all that, I quit my job and moved to an entirely different state. I still wake up from time to time, feverish and terror-filled, that house still coming to haunt me in my dreams. I often wonder why it showed me what it did. I wonder about the man and the child and what it all meant. What it did fail to mention, though, was that when I was 7, I had nearly drowned. And even though I can't recall what the pool looked like exactly, there was something oddly familiar about all of it, almost like death had felt cheated, and that in some strange way, it was coming back to claim the one that got away. So yes, as silly as this all sounds, and regardless of whether you believe me or not, I used to be a real estate agent, and after trying to sell a liminal space, I quit.